This morning, Idaho quadruple murder suspect Bryan Kohberger just hours from his extradition hearing. His lawyer, Jason Labar, telling ABC News he remains calm and polite despite knowing the death penalty is on the table. He says Kohberger understands the seriousness of the charges and replied to him, quote, "This will be a long process."
Foreseeable and predictable. That's what the lawsuit argues was the case in the 4 University of Idaho murders back in 2022. Parents of Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Madison Mogan argue WSU failed to protect the community and ignored numerous complaints about the convicted killer Bryan Kohberger leading up to the murders.
We were all annoyed by him, and so I knew his name. I knew like, oh, T.A. Bryan, like he sucks at this. Like he's grading us too harshly, and that was like an annoyance. But obviously beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird and kind of, a bad grader.
The latest stuff is a lawsuit filed just days ago by the families of the 4 young victims against Washington State University. That's where Kohberger was working towards a PhD in criminology, no less, and where his abbreviated stay gave rise to reports of very bad behavior.
As a criminology graduate student and employee at WSU, Kohberger had several altercations with other graduate students that made them feel unsafe months before the 2022 murders. They also reveal on several occasions WSU professors and university police escorted several female graduate students home, believing Kohberger was stalking them.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Have a look at item number 4 in the lawsuit. On November 13, 2022, a foreseeable and in fact predictable tragedy occurred when Kohberger entered the bedrooms of 4 undergraduate students and violently stabbed them to death. These deaths should not and would not have occurred if WSU had acted appropriately. Kohberger's search history also revealed internet searches about psychopaths, paranoia, and porn involving exclusively non-consensual sex acts. Kohberger's search history also included research on a serial killer named Danny Rowling, who murdered 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida, by entering a college apartment through a sliding glass door, masked and dressed in black, and stabbed his victims to death using a K-bar knife. All features of the Idaho 4 murders. And then also this. One WSU professor warned her colleagues at that meeting that Kohberger was a predator. He is smart enough that in 4 years we will have to give him a PhD. Mark my word, I work with predators. If we give him a PhD, that's the guy that in many years, when he is a professor, we will hear is harassing, stalking, and sexually abusing his students at wherever university he attended. Now, hindsight is 20/20, and certainly if one examines Kohberger's backstory in detail, especially in the months and weeks before the murders, the downward spiral he was on did seem inevitable. On this channel, we make a point of trying to recognize patterns not only in others, but also in ourselves. This is what makes this charge particularly damning, that Kohberger, a mass killer in the making, was polishing up his own criminal psychology, essentially putting the finishing touches on his own diabolical scheme while he attended and taught at a criminal faculty. So what about the people around him? And also the question is, was it in fact predictable? Stay tuned for my thoughts on this question, as well as on 2 more questions at the end of this analysis. The other 2 questions are, did WSU not act appropriately? And if not, why not? But before we drill down into some of the contents of that lawsuit, pretty fascinating stuff, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button. Also, wait till the end of this episode for links to some of my coverage on Bad Teachergate. And let's get started. Now, according to the New York Times, a new lawsuit claims the Washington State University, where Bryan Kohberger was a PhD student, failed to take decisive action on earlier complaints that he was stalking women. I think there were more than a dozen. Now, what this shows is, to their credit, they were alerted to problems with Kohberger, in fact, many problems. Back to the New York Times, according to the lawsuit, WSU hired Koberger as a TA, a teaching assistant, in its criminal justice and criminology department, and provided him with a salary, tuition benefits, health insurance, and on-campus housing. I actually went to his particular apartment complex, walked on those stairs that he would have taken every day when I visited Moscow and when I visited Pullman. The victims' families allege the university had extensive authority over Koberger's conduct, but failed to act despite mounting concerns. The complaint says that WSU received at least 13 formal reports accusing Koberger of threatening, stalking, harassing, or predatory behavior toward female students and staff during the fall 2022 semester. That is a lot of transgressions in a short time. And so what is extraordinary about this is that Koberger clearly had a gripe, a bone to pick, a chip on his shoulder when it came to the opposite sex. This is why, in my opinion, Koberger should be thought of as an incel, much like Elliot Rodger. Incidentally, even the kids on campus thought of him in those terms as well, as an incel. Hence, there's a reference to incels in the lawsuit. It's this point 264. Koberger's co-workers in the WSU criminal justice program believed that he was an incel, or involuntary celibate, and was sexually frustrated. I wrote a book on incels, and if there's a particular group of frustrated young men with pent-up rage that are particularly dangerous, especially to women, it's this group. Back to the New York Times, the families argue university officials did not meaningfully investigate those complaints, those 13 complaints, or remove Koberger from campus before the murders, even though they had the authority to do so. Well, they did investigate Koberger's conduct, and they were to some extent aware of Koberger's conduct. I don't want to defend the university authorities here, but there is a certain amount of unwanted attention on any and every high school or college campus where people from different walks of life are brought together. I'm not sure if one can criminalize every eager male pursuing the cold approach, but having said that, Koberger was clearly not like everyone else. In my opinion, they did meaningfully investigate Koberger in the sense that they did chastise him and they did fire him. Look at this headline from February 2023. Brian Koberger was fired from WSU teaching job days before Idaho murder's arrest, report says. According to The Independent, Brian Koberger was facing disciplinary action in his teaching assistant job at WSU around the time of the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, before he was ultimately fired from the position days prior to his arrest. Now, an interesting caveat to this whole argument is whether actually taking these actions against Brian didn't actually trigger some sort of murderous rage or an intention to get payback. Another question one could ask is, was there a different way of dealing with this that could have de-escalated the situation? And the fact is, he was fired from his teaching position even before he was arrested. According to The Independent, the 28-year-old criminology PhD student began working as a TA in the criminology department in August as part of his graduate program. But within a month, he was already under investigation by the university because of behavioral problems and a sexist attitude towards women, according to News Nation. Within a month, that is fairly quick work from the university's side, right? The outlet obtained a detailed timeline of his issues in the department, revealing that Mr. Koberger was warned multiple times about his behavior and was brought into several meetings with professors due to their concerns.
He only started as a TA at the end of August, but the problem started right away on September 23rd. Look at this timeline. There are just mere, sometimes days and short weeks in between each issue.
One might argue that what was done was too little too late, but if you consider Koberger started teaching in August, actually the end of August, and committed the murders in mid-November, well, the relevant authorities really didn't have a heck of a lot of time to work with or to play catch-up. Remember, in institutions like this, there's a disciplinary process, and part of that involves an evaluation, an outcome, and a response, and each of these would take time. Just over 3 months is precious little time to figure out that you have a psycho in your midst, and to their credit, they sort of did. Now, if Koberger was on the scene for a year and he committed the murders after that sort of period of time, that would seem to be unforgivable paralysis, unforgivable entropy on the side of the faculty. But the fact is, he started in August, and by December, they had already kicked him out. According to The Independent, his attitude towards women was cited as a key concern, with a criminal justice student allegedly being rude to women, grading the women that he taught differently to the men, and having a sexist attitude towards females he interacted with at the school. Now, being rude isn't a crime, although I guess it depends how rude you are. But none of these are, strictly speaking, crimes. But you may remember I joined the dots and highlighted Koberger's highly sexist behavior, as well as Koberger's trouble with the faculty and with students in several bad Teachergate videos. Do you remember that? I found it interesting how even when I was alerting the true crime community to this, many didn't seem to see a connection. Instead, the focus seemed to be either that Koberger was a serial killer. This is in the early days. In other words, people were more interested in speculating on what we didn't know than on what we did know. Or they wanted to focus on the idea that he was definitely stalking Maddie, Kaylee, and possibly Xana. And there was some evidence to suggest this was true, but we never found out for sure if there was a connection, for example, to the Mad Greek restaurant or not. And you remember Maddie used to work there. But that was the focus, on what we didn't know rather than on what we did know. For example, did you know that Koberger was fired from another school as well? On June 22nd, 2021, Koberger acknowledged in writing, he said, "I understand that if I do not resign, I have a right to a school board hearing to determine if I should be dismissed from employment with a school district."
How are we supposed to know?
Yeah. Right. How are you supposed to know?
So if the true crime community couldn't join the dots regarding bad Teachergate after the fact, as I say, remember, the true crime community were very caught up in the whole serial killer thing. Well, how was the campus supposed to do that before the fact? Anyway, according to the New York Times, Koberger's discriminatory and harassing behavior was so extreme, pervasive, and objectively offensive that female classmates would flee the classroom in the middle of instruction, even leaving their possessions behind, according to the lawsuit. This was actually addressed, if you remember, in a New York Times article in February 2023. University investigated Idaho murder suspects' behavior around the time of the killings. Also, Brian Koberger had a verbal altercation with a professor and was investigated over his behavior around female students before he was charged. According to the New York Times, female students, staff, and faculty felt threatened and scared by his aggressive staring, looming behind them and being at uncomfortably close quarters, physically blocking their exit and following them to their vehicles, necessitating routine security escorts. I do find it interesting that Koberger wasn't simply bullying students, he seemed to be bullying faculty as well, notably female faculty. But I think there's a case even where a male faculty member left his office because Koberger wouldn't do so. According to the Times, Mr. Koberger began having troubles about a month into the fall semester, his first at Washington State. He had an altercation on September 23rd with John Snyder, the WSU professor he was assisting, according to the termination letter, a copy of which was obtained by the New York Times. So that brings us to these three questions, which I'm now going to express my opinion on. And the first one is, the question is, was it in fact predictable? In hindsight, of course, yes. In real time, well, you would have had to do an in-depth investigation prior to the crimes, and I mean, how realistic is that? And that would involve stalking and invading the privacy of innocent people, just as people were complaining he was invading their privacy. I mean, in order to realistically prevent the Idaho 4 massacre, you couldn't very well investigate every single student at both campuses prior to the crime even being committed. And the question here is, how deeply do you investigate Brian? Do you just investigate what he's doing at the campus, or do you go into his backstory? But imagine if you had to do that with every student, with every case. The other thing is, I'm not sure Koberger even intended to kill as many students as he did. I don't think he knew for sure that Ethan was there, for example, or even that Kaylee was there. So if he didn't know exactly what he was going to do, how was the university supposed to know? Number 2, did WSU not act appropriately? Well, I would say they were certainly on the right track. According to the New York Times, on November 2nd, department leaders met with Koberger to discuss an improvement plan. And here it is. And have a look at points 298, 299, and 300 from the complaint. On Tuesday, November 8th, that was 6 days later, WSU conducted a remedial mandatory discrimination and harassment training for all graduate students due to Koberger's inappropriate behavior. So the whole freaking department had to go through this training basically to address Koberger. During Koberger's attendance at this training, WSU staff saw him sitting in the back of the room with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. How do you think he felt about this? 299, the graduate students knew that the discrimination and harassment training was specifically due to Koberger's behavior. You can imagine how this just increased the animus that he felt towards them and vice versa. 300, the November 8 discrimination and harassment training embarrassed Koberger in front of his entire cohort. And this is something the WAVR 21 guidance specifically advised against and warned that in a campus setting, problematic individuals are most likely to become violent in the days following a shameful or rejecting event such as a reprimand. 5 days later, the 4 University of Idaho students were stabbed to death overnight in a home just off campus in Moscow, Idaho. I have no doubt that Koberger's travails with his own faculty were expressed in the murders at that time. Think about the alternative. If they had somehow accommodated Koberger, if Koberger's neighbor had made more time for him, if Koberger had somehow found a girlfriend or even a friend, perhaps if he had simply taken up jogging or gotten a pet, who knows, these events may have taken a different turn. And do you remember this?
But not only are we hearing that he was grading women differently, but also that he was rude to women and that he, quote, had a sexist attitude.
My personal opinion was that the way the department handled one of these interventions, where they basically had Koberger face dozens of students, 75 to be exact, where half of them criticized and attacked him, this tough love approach was, I think, humiliating and triggering. And this was, I think, out of line for the faculty.
He scheduled a day where everyone, came in ready to argue to get their grades up, and he brought in Brian and he was like, all right, go at him. And he had Brian stand up and everyone was, like a few people were on his side because they wanted to keep their high grades and not like have questions be cut out or whatever. But for the most part, it was like, half of a 150 person class just asking him all these real critical questions and he would answer. And he'd actually, he tried pretty hard to defend himself, which was the kind of thing that our professor loved. He wanted the like courtroom environment. And so there was just a period of class where we were all sort of arguing about this. It wasn't like yelling or anything, but it was certainly conflict,
According to the New York Times, in the termination document, officials described a second altercation that Koberger had with a professor after the killings. That was December 9th. Later that month, the department decided to remove him from his position as a TA, cutting off his pay and saying that he had not made progress regarding professionalism. Now, I realize the University of Idaho isn't WSU, but their decision to raise the funhouse was, I thought, appropriate. I mean, that was a significant effort to protect the sensibilities and interests of the students on campus, as well as dissuading trauma merchants from monetizing the site. And that brings us to the third question: why didn't WSU act appropriately? To put it simply, because they were afraid Koberger might sue them. Look at this. Point 16, Koberger's supervising instructor was concerned that removing him from employment would open the university up to a civil lawsuit from Koberger, thereby elevating the financial interests of the university above the safety and security of students. According to the New York Times, in the case of the female students, the university's investigation did not find Mr. Koberger guilty of any wrongdoing, and that, I think, is quite a critical point. It was the other matters that prompted the decision to eliminate his funding and remove him from the teaching assistant job. That decision, they said, was based on his unsatisfactory performance as a teaching assistant, including his failure to meet the norms of professional behavior in his interactions with the faculty. So in a sense, they basically almost pretended that all of these issues with the female students weren't taking place. And you can see how clearly the faculty were trying to protect themselves from legal repercussions from Kohberger, but I guess it was a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. By the way, you can read the full lawsuit at this link. I'll put it in the description. And let me know if you'd like me to continue analysis on this particular case in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.